Okay, good afternoon and welcome to you all. We are especially excited to have with us today Professor Bill Mitchell. The last time was in February 2020 in Manchester, and given everything that has happened in between, it seems a very long time ago. So welcome, Bill.
Thank you.
We are living in unstable times. As Antonio Gramsci put it, referring to a very different age, the old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters. Or at least that's how it seems to many of us. What that new world will look like is uncertain as the geopolitical shifts in power and influence continue to draw a new paradigm. Whilst the biggest challenges remain before us, addressing the socially and economically destabilizing crisis of climate change, the political establishment remains committed to a path that will reinforce planetary destabilization, the vast politically induced inequities and unfair distribution of wealth. After a period of government showing its capacity as the currency issuer to spend to manage the consequences of a global pandemic, followed by a conflict which upset trade routes and food and energy supplies, it now seems that political parties are vying once again to show us how fiscally disciplined they are, as if it was some sort of competition that will determine their electability. The words deficit and debt are again the flavour of the month. Never mind that public infrastructure is in a state of decay, or the growth of food banks, homelessness, insecure, low-wage employment, all of which threaten the health and economic and social well-being of citizens. We are led to believe that unless we can grow the economy to raise more taxes or pay down public debt, there is no alternative to more sacrifice. Thatcher's mantra lives on. It is drummed into the public by self-serving media daily, even when the consequences of such thinking are plain for all to see. People, according to this narrative, must accept their immiseration without complaint, because there is no money. The obvious holes in this argument should be evident, particularly in this time of global instability and uncertainty. The political agendas of both parties are based on this narrative, and yet the glaring contradiction of this position is ever clearer. When there never seems to be an end to the public money for prosecuting wars, to feed the profits of the arms industry, or support the corporations, as if all we really need is a bit of trickle-down to sort it out. This surely is a time for a public wake-up call. The very structures which form the foundations for a healthy economy that supports and enriches the lives of citizens, from health to education, public institutions such as local government, along with the infrastructure that businesses depend on to function, have all been decimated by such politically driven narratives. The fundamental question is, which comes first? Jeremy Hunt's claim in 2016 that a strong NHS needs a strong economy is surely back to front. Then we have the world of Cameron's big society, which is in itself crumbling because of such narratives. And if it weren't so serious, it would be laughable that Gordon Brown, remember that safe pair of hands, talked last November about corporate social responsibility and how we urgently need a new social contract between companies and charities to create initiatives that redistribute surplus goods. Doesn't he know about the currency issuing capacity of government? We seem to have stepped back into the Victorian age as over decades we have witnessed a shift in provision of essential services from the state to voluntary charitable institutions which remove state responsibility and undermine accountability. Worse, the private sector has been invited to provide public services funded with public money to service its profit streams, all at the expense of people's health and well-being. Like the little boy staring at a naked emperor, whilst the courtiers fawn over his clothes sense, those of us that challenge this paradigm are again witnessing further reinforcement of a political ideology that prioritizes the market and serves the big corporations instead of public purpose. While politicians fight it out again over fiscal responsibility, remembering Liam Burns' "There is no money left," society continues to fragment, public institutions to decay, and people's lives to be wrecked. At such a time, it is ever more important for those of us who want to challenge that status quo to double down on our efforts to educate a misinformed public, to show what the possibilities of such knowledge are, and to demonstrate that their economic situation does not derive from lack of money except their own, or indeed their own shortcomings. That it is the political choices made by politicians that dictate whether they are serving the public purpose or not. Our lived reality provides the evidence that currently they are not. Japan has shown the way in its fiscal and monetary policy, which has held in good stead for decades and proved the point. Our own politicians and the institutions that uphold and promote mainstream thinking could learn much from their approach, assuming, of course, they are politically motivated to do so. In fact, I think Dirk Entz did a tweet yesterday which sort of frames it perfectly. Those who argued that public deficits, public debt, higher interest rates, higher inflation, hyperinflation, a fiscal mess, would befall Japan have been wrong every single time. But when all's said and done, it all starts with education. And GIMMS and the Edmonton podcast are dedicated to turning the tide of mainstream economic thought through their educational outreach. We have made some progress, but there is still a way to go to ensure a stable, fairer, and a sustainable world for future generations. Thank you very much.
Well, for those of us out there who are familiar with MMT, and I guess most of you, Professor Bill Mitchell doesn't need much introduction. He was there at the start, of course, one of the founding fathers. In my mind, his meeting with Warren, the two minds together, that's what I see as the beginning of MMT. And then Mr. Andy Ray came on a little bit later, so for me those are the big three. So we've got a founding father with us, and that's great to have Bill here. Bill's a fantastic academic. You will have no doubt read many of his works, his papers, books. They're all on his website, and also he's famous for his blog. How anybody can write that much and at that quality leaves most of us bemused. When Bill broached the idea of a blog some years ago, I think even his colleagues doubted whether he could make this work, but it's obviously become the go-to blog for MMT globally. And it's a habit Bill's got, really, I think, of proving his critics wrong. And that's kind of run through his career. He doesn't take a backward step, which you'll find out when he talks about mainstream economics. He tells it as it is, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy his presentation as it goes today. Basically, Bill's a strong critic of mainstream economics. aren't we all? And what Bill describes as the groupthink, failed paradigm, degenerating research program, however, if you're a philosopher out there, however you want to describe it. And what Bill's really bringing today is, building on what Prue has said, is let's look at Japan, because the mainstream has ignored Japan. It's an outlier. You might, if my memory of philosophy serves me right, I think it was John Stuart Mill said, could be wrong, the exception that proves the rule. Well, an exception can't prove the rule. It disproves the rule. So basically, Japan frightens the mainstream because it shows us another way. There is another way. I'm going to hand over to Bill now to bring his insights into Japan and to challenge you a bit what we can learn from Japan and compare it to our own experience. So I'll hand over now to Bill Mitchell.
Okay, thanks very much, and thanks for taking your time, and thanks to the wonderful women of GIMMS again. Thanks.
Thank you. Right, that's better. And Carlos, hi. And thanks to the wonderful women of GIMMS who are resolute in their determination to make changes. I've got my air purifier here, and you might laugh about that, but I hang out with epidemiologists at lunchtime occasionally, and what they've told me over the years, initially they told me in 2020 that we all should be very cautious, and because of the deep uncertainty of the nature of the disease, COVID. And as they've done, my friends work at the Burnet Institute in Melbourne, Australia, and that's one of the world's leading research foundations studying COVID now. And what they're now telling me is that for many years humanity fought and won the battle against a number of diseases, like typhoid and smallpox and polio and all of these diseases. And that we just assumed that we would do the same with COVID. But they said COVID's nothing like these previous diseases. There is no cure. It attacks every human organ, and it's a lottery in the infection stage which organ it attacks. But what they're now coming up with, the research, which scientifically has a fairly firm foundation now because they've got a lot more data, is that they're now hypothesising that we've reached peak sort of health for humanity, and that this disease is permanently compromising the health of humanity, and it's the first of many similar types of incurable diseases that will cause a permanent deterioration in our health. And so that's why I'm very cautious. I have this air purifier, wear masks, I don't really mix in. This is one of the first presentations I've done in a long time. And I urge you all to take it seriously. It's not a cold, it's not a flu. It's major compromise of human health, permanent compromise. We've reached the peak and we're now dead. This is the first of the deterioration. So that explains my conservative nature. A lot's happened, as Prue said, and in 4 years. And I remember the last time I was a guest of GIMMS, I got back to Australia one day before they closed the international borders, and I would have got stuck here in Europe for more than a year if I hadn't got back that day. As it happens, I got stuck interstate for 12 weeks because the internal borders were shut. So a lot has happened in Britain. A lot's happened. You've successfully exited yourself from the European Union, and which was, to me, a wonderful step forward for Britain. And a lot of people, you read every day, oh, Brexit's been a disaster. Well, we don't know whether it's been a disaster yet because the data can't be disentangled. The pandemic and all of that has caused dreadful noise in the data. So I'm an econometrician. I study, I model data. It's one of my professional things. And the time series are just so out of kilter. We can't really know whether Brexit's been a success or a failure yet. So I don't buy into the arguments from the progressives who tell you that Brexit's been an uncategorical disaster. We don't know whether it has or not. And I can tell you that coming into London last night into Heathrow, I got through Heathrow in a very crowded arrival hall, the quickest I have in 25 years, because European citizens now are lumped in with Australians, whereas previously they had the priority and we had to wait in long queues. Now we all just go through. So for me, Brexit's a great success. Let's talk a bit about MMT specific things that have happened since I was last here. I believe there's been a lack of progress. I believe that what the pandemic did was cause a major momentum loss, because in leading up to the pandemic, we were gaining really strong momentum. And I was booked to do workshops in Africa, in South America, all through Europe. I was coming to Europe, 6 times a year, things like that. And everything just stopped. And the communication stopped. Yeah, we still had social media, which is a problem in itself, but the progress we were making, particularly with governments, slowed dramatically. And I think in that time there's also been somewhat a fragmentation of the MMT group. We don't have international conferences anymore where we all get together. We've always got together every year. We don't do that anymore. And there's also been, and it's a delicate thing, there's also been, in my view, a fragmentation where personal agendas have, in my view, usurped the common good of promoting the knowledge. I won't go into specifics. And furthermore, I think that basic communication channels like the social media has become a problem rather than a benefit. And I think you now get all of these Facebook heroes and what do they call it, X, Twitter, and having these wars with people and personal attacks on people in the name of MMT, which just doesn't help us at all. It makes us out to be bloody clowns. And, I really despair when I read some of these Twitter wars that are going on and vilification of people who might be ignorant, but they're still people. And you still should treat people the way you want to be treated yourself. And I think social media has abandoned that rule, and all of these silent heroes that wouldn't say the same thing to your face, on both sides of the debate, by the way. And I don't want them promoting my work in that way. So that's happened. We've also got private equity companies in Australia funding universities promoting MMT postgraduate courses, which I'm deeply upset about, because the people involved know damn well that they're promoting using my ideas to make private profit when I wouldn't dare sell tertiary education to anybody. It should be free. But they're providing profits for an American private equity company. So that's happened. What else has happened? Inflation's happened. And of course, this was the mainstream saw in the inflationary episode that we're just about through, not quite, as being a testimony to the fact that MMT is a flawed cult. And right at the beginning, I remember, I think it was July 2021, I got an op-ed in The Guardian, one of the few that they've ever published from me. The Guardian's very hard to get through to. And at that point, inflation was just starting to take off. And my hypothesis was it was a transitory event. We should just be patient, if you've got a once in 100-year global pandemic, where workers can't go to work for months on end, where the service sector is basically completely shut down, where governments provide income support to people who aren't working, who are locked in their homes but still have access to the internet. And so they decided to do DIY and improve their homes and buy all this stuff online. The goods market that they're buying in can't possibly adjust that quickly. What do you expect was going to happen? Well, of course we were going to get inflationary pressures when things can't get delivered on time and boat containers are in the wrong ports and all the rest of it. Of course there was going to be inflation. But to assume that it was a demand-side inflation was like saying about Zimbabwe when their agricultural sector collapsed, that was too much spending. Well, yeah, it was too much spending, but that wasn't the driving factor. It was too little supply. And a lot of MMTs at that point became incredibly defensive. And very similar, I likened it to what happened in the 1970s, when I was just starting to become aware of things as a young person, when the inflation then, driven by the October 1973 OPEC oil price hike initially, Milton Friedman's monetarists used that inflation as an example of why the Keynesian macro consensus at the time was deeply flawed. And that became the beginnings of the paradigm shift of monetarism and later new classical economics, new Keynesian economics, and the blight that my profession imposes upon the world now. And at that time, Keynesians, the mainstream at the time, were incredibly defensive. They didn't know how to argue their case. The Marxists knew that it was a struggle over the distribution of income. That when you get a imported raw material price shock, like oil, and you've got oil dependency, well then if labour and capital both have some power, they're going to fight it out who takes the real income loss. And that's what happened in the 1970s. Trade unions were still quite strong. In Australia, trade unions at that point had coverage of about 55% of the workforce. Now that's 13%. Now, and that's global trend. But at that time, trade unions were able to try to engage in real wage resistance, in other words, to defend the real purchasing power of their nominal wage by pushing wage demands. Bosses were, in concentrated industries, were able to pass them on to protect their real profit margins, and you had inflation. And the Keynesians didn't have a bloody clue. And because they wouldn't embrace anything remotely Marxist, they couldn't initially fight it out on that terrain. And I liken that to the way a lot of MMT people have engaged in the current inflationary pressures. They became incredibly defensive because they weren't in a position to really think it through, that it was just a transitory event. And that it was going to, and it would resolve when boats started going to where they had to, and factories opened again, and the imbalance between demand for services and demand for goods resolved somewhat. And I think even people like Joseph Stiglitz now are saying, yeah, the transitory gang were right. Now, in that time, I've been incredibly vilified by even my own colleagues for daring to take a strong position that it was transitory and that it didn't need any demand-side policies at all, other than to provide some income support for low-income families to get them through the cost of living pressures. That's what the fiscal authority should have been doing. And the other thing that's happened in the 4 years is this Green New Deal nonsense. And I'll talk a bit about that later. And, you know, in a nutshell, in 2 seconds, I keep reading MMTers saying, oh, well, Green New Deal is going to be disruptive. This is the so-called restructuring of the economy to become low carbon. which is absolutely essential. And it's going to be highly disruptive. Well, how do we, and the critics say, oh yeah, but what are you going to do with all the jobs in the mines and what are you going to do with those communities that have mortgages, that have kids going to school, that have to take care of their families? What are you going to do with all them? And the MMT characters say, oh, we've got a job guarantee. Well, fuck me. In 1978, I came up with the idea of the job guarantee, long before I'd even met Warren. And at that time, that we had high inflation in Australia, and the mainstream monetarists were saying we had to create unemployment. And I wanted to come up with an idea as a fourth-year honours student at Melbourne University where we could deal with the inflationary problem without creating unemployment. And that's how I came up with the idea of buffer stocks and the job guarantee. But it was not and when I met Warren in the sort of mid-90s, he had a similar idea, slightly different and different genus, but similar idea, and we both understood that what it basically meant was that the government could influence the price level by the price it paid for goods, in this case labour. So that was how we melded, that was the beginning of MMT. But the point was that it was never a scheme to solve job destruction arising from structural change. Our aim was that the job guarantee in MMT is absolutely central, absolutely crucial, and government should aim to minimise the pool of job guarantee workers at all times. Not rely on it to pick up every worker that becomes unemployed. If we're going to have a green transition, then we should be aiming to create high-skilled, high-productivity, interesting, fulfilling jobs for everybody who's displaced. Not a minimum wage job guarantee. All right. I'm in a really lucky position also these days because I have 3 jobs, one in Newcastle, at University of Newcastle in Australia, where I've been since 1990, one in the University of Helsinki, a professorial appointment there, and one of the reasons I'm in Europe is I was going there next week. I go there every February. Haven't been for 4 years. It's all been online. And I'm not going next week now because the trade unions have closed down the air traffic next week in Finland, protesting against their right-wing Eurozone promoting government. So I'm sort of stuck at the moment, but that's another story. But the third appointment I now have is a professorial appointment at Kyoto University. And one of the things that's sort of been closing a loop for me personally, because one of the reasons I started to do the work that now is called MMT was in the early 90s, Japan had a major commercial property collapse after the big debt boom, neoliberal debt boom in the late 80s. So commercial property in Tokyo collapsed by 60 to 70%, massive. And I was just a young academic at that point. And what I observed was one negative quarter of GDP in 1993. And I said to myself as a interesting person, how the hell did they do that? And then I started to become really interested in Japan, and I observed, fiscal deficits above 10% of GDP continually. Bank of Japan running very low, using their reserve management capacity to run zero interest, short-term interest rates. Then increasingly buying a lot of the government debt, now owning 46%. Since the pandemic, almost all of the government debt's been bought by the Bank of Japan. And I saw my mainstream colleagues, including Nobel Prize winners, which is a joke, predicting in 1994, 1995, 1996, keep going, predicting that Japan would become bankrupt, that there'd be hyperinflation, that the bond markets would retaliate. I kept looking at bid to cover ratios in the bond auctions, always above 2. So in other words, there were always twice as many bond investors seeking bonds than there were bonds on issue. And, the bond investors are going to retaliate, bid to cover ratio 2, not happening. there'll be hyperinflation, inflation started to fall and then become negative. In other words, not just deflation, but disinflation. And, so Japan became my laboratory, my real world laboratory. And so when I say it's closed a circle for me, now having a job there and being part of the system and having really close contacts with the Bank of Japan and the Cabinet Office and this sort of thing is really, I'm very lucky. So I want to talk to you a bit about what I know about Japan from the inside. Now the facts are I've just mentioned some of the facts. Major shock, investment collapsed, government responded with a huge fiscal injection in the 90s. All of the main macroeconomic parameters are way beyond anything that we're typically used to. So they're extraordinary, some of the policy shifts in Japan. Now, I don't think they're extraordinary at all, but they look extraordinary to the mainstream. And, Paul Krugman goes to Japan, IMF goes there, you're going to run out of money, all this stuff. Never happened. So then they say, that's because Japan is different. That its culture is different, that's why. And what you learn is that culture is very important, but the monetary institutions in Japan and the fiscal institutions work exactly the same way as they do in Britain, in Australia, in America, in everywhere that there's a fiat monetary system. Can we just put that slide up? Yeah, thank you. So these are, if you speak Japanese, you will be able to read the script. If you don't, I'll tell you what it means. So culture is very important, and place is very important in Japanese culture. And what I mean by place, I don't mean where you live. It's your place with apropos of others, and that is multidimensional. So you have a place in the age distribution. So Japanese people have a great reverence for older people because they appreciate what their experience and their knowledge and their forbearance. And you also have a place in the workforce, and you have a place in the family, and you have a place in your neighbourhood. And that conditions everything. So when I was trying to learn Japanese, I realised there were 15 personal pronouns rather in English there's one. In Japan there's I think 15. And which personal pronoun you use depends upon the situation you're in, who you're talking to, what's the context. And that makes it hard to learn the language, I can tell you. But once you get it, you learn how extraordinary this concept of place is. And these principles, omoyari, omotenashi, kia, zaka, these principles are very important in Japanese society, and we don't have them very much in Western society anymore. And what they mean is that selfless compassion, omoyari, that you're always thinking of your impact upon the other person if you're in a situation. So there's a famous historical fact that explains why there's very little conflict in Japanese society. Because in the 15th century, the legal system would punish both parties to a conflict. So we have this highly litigious system in the English-speaking world, where you have a conflict with your neighbour and you go to court and the judge makes some decision as to the balance of who's to blame. Well, in Japan, everybody's to blame if there's conflict. And so you're very aware of your impact upon the others around you, in the way you speak, in the way you act. And it's a very respectful cultural aspect. The miscellaneous goods, zakah, that's what it means literally. But what it means culturally is that you find beauty in very simple, mundane things. Every fine detail is to be beautiful. And you see that in the way they prepare food. If you go to a vegan, my favourite, given my dietary preferences, my favourite cafe is a little vegan cafe around from where I live in Kyoto. And the time they take to prepare the food, so it's beautiful as well as nutritious. That's what zakah means. And the point I'm making here is that that's incredibly contrasted to the way English-speaking Western societies have gone. And so our obsession now is with individuality. I grew up in Australian society where our obsession was the collective will, where Australians like to say, oh, we're an egalitarian society. Our textbooks when we were at school were The Australian Legend by Russell Ward. Egalitarian society, we look after each other, the mateship from the war years, you look out for your mates and all, cobbers, all this sort of rubbish. Well, it's rubbish in the way we talk about it now because we don't even believe it. And what's happened since the 1970s is that collective concept of society, that there's such a thing as society, we've let it go. And these cultural aspects of Japanese culture are all about society, are all about solidarity, about looking after each other, caring for what your impact upon each other is. So when economists try to defend their lack of predictive capacity in the case of Japan, say just culture, they haven't got a clue about any of this. They say things like, oh, well, it's because Japanese people buy all the debt. Well, that's true. The government debt, that is. That's true initially. The Bank of Japan then buys it anyway. But in the primary issue, it's Japanese citizens buy the primary issue, and then the Bank of Japan hoovers it all up in the secondary market once it's been issued at the auction. But that just completely misses the point. It wouldn't matter if the Japanese people didn't buy any of the debt. That doesn't explain why they make poor predictions. And the whole descent into this individual paradigm that the rest of our societies have taken since the 1970s. If you've read my book with Thomas Farzi about reclaiming the state, you'll know that we've traced all of that. And the simple story is that was initially, that happened because the left allowed the right, the conservative side of the debate, to run the show, and the left abandoned the macroeconomic debate and then got lost in identity issues. Now, don't get me wrong, identity is all of the stuff about ethnicity and gender and the rest of it. they're important areas of inquiry, and we need to make progress in them because people's lives matter. I heard a radio program driving to the airport this week in Melbourne. It was discussing the legislation in America, anti-trans legislation. And it's just frightening what the American states in the last 5 years have done. Pernicious legislation against people who express gender dysphoria. All those things are really important. But the left got lost in those things and surrendered the macroeconomic debate to the conservatives. So there was a book in 1973, James O'Connor, The Fiscal Crisis of the State, for God's sake. And then, you're well aware, I'm sure, James Callaghan in September 1976, saying that the time when governments could improve employment by spending is over. Well, that's what Milton Friedman said, for God's sake. And you had Dennis Healy as his chancellor, a monetarist, for God's sake. And then you had in France, Francois Mitterrand and the terrible Jacques Delors, elected in 1983 on a socialist agenda to redress the terrible things that Raymond Barre, as the finance minister, had done to the union movement and to workers in the name of fighting inflation. And Mitterrand gets elected to turn that all back, and then has the turn to austerity in 1983. And then Jacques Delors, of course, goes on to become European Commission boss, rigs the whole Delors committee, which was the input into the Maastricht Treaty, and Bob's your uncle. You've got Europe surrendering their currencies, the member states surrendering their currencies. Well, this all came from the Labor, the Social Democrats, all of that stuff. And if we're really going to make progress, then that's where I have seen my role in my career, to try to re-educate the left on macroeconomics, so that they don't just mimic the fictions that the mainstream, which are, and I could give you a lecture on how mainstream economics actually evolved in the late 19th century as an antidote to Marxism, funded by industrial capital. Well, now it's funded by finance capital. But I won't give you that lecture, I've just given a brief synopsis. And so the real challenge remains to really educate people on macroeconomics. Now, what about culture? Well, what do those four things do? Well, as I said before, they don't alter the way the monetary system operates. Japan's monetary institutions, Bank of Japan, the bond markets, the commercial banking sector, the fiscal side, the way in which the Cabinet Office works, there's nuances and there's slight institutional differences, but effectively they work exactly the same way as they do in Australia, in America, in Britain, wherever you like to know. So culture doesn't alter, those institutions. What those principles, those cultural artefacts, and I could have listed more, what they do is influence the policy choices. And this is where a long time ago I formed the dichotomy about MMT to help people understand what it was. I talked about lenses versus values. MMT is a lens. It's not a policy regime that you shift to or shift away from. So when progressives say, won't it be great if we have MMT? Well, they haven't got a clue. Or when others say, won't it be shocking if we have MMT? Thank God we don't have MMT anymore, these people have been saying recently. Well, haven't got a clue. MMT is not a policy regime, it's a lens, it's a framework for understanding the monetary system. And then to traverse from that understanding into policy space, you need an ideology, a set of values. And an extreme right-wing ideologue who understood MMT in the same way that I understand it would have same understanding of the way the monetary system works, but have totally different policies. I'd have public education, public schools, public transport, no privatisation, blah, blah. They would have all the other stuff that we've probably got now. And so that applies in the case of understanding how Japan works. That the culture is the ideology, if you like. The lens, the same monetary system, they just use the monetary system and its institutions in a different way. And so what have they done in the case of the inflationary period? Well, the Bank of Japan boss said, this is a transitory event. They knew that all along. And they said, why would we treat it like a demand side event? Because if you have a demand side event, well then you have to run constrained fiscal policy. Or if you think interest rates are going to suppress demand, you would have to push up interest rates. No, I don't think that. I'd constrain it through fiscal policy, which was the genus of the job guarantee, by the way. But if it's not a demand side event, well then you wouldn't do anything like that. And so the Bank of Japan made a very clear decision to leave their short-term interest rate negative. And the Cabinet Office, who runs fiscal policy through the Ministry of Finance, made a decision that this is a short-term event and poorer households are significantly disadvantaged by the cost rises. And, you know, in the supermarkets, I haven't been back from Japan very long, just came back in December after several months, and the shops, the prices are very high there relative to previous years. So the Bank of the fiscal authorities said, okay, well, we need to give some cash transfers to low-income houses, which is what they did. And they also gave some cash subsidies to businesses to induce them not to pass on the rising import prices. So Japan had exactly the same cost shocks as Australia and everywhere else did through the import side. And they also said, well, we know that if we hold interest rates constant, with the US Federal Reserve and all the other central banks pushing up interest rates, we know that that will cause carry trade away from the yen, which will cause some depreciation, which it did. And of course, all the bond markets were going, oh, the currency is going to collapse. Well, the Minister of Finance just said, look, we're going to tolerate some depreciation in the yen, and we'll take the upside because suddenly our real exchange rate, our international competitiveness, has now improved because our exports were now cheaper in all other currencies. These guys, and guys is a generic term. These guys are smart. And of course, what's happened? Well, Japan's inflation rate fell much more quickly than anywhere else, despite having the same surge. And it's falling everywhere. And what have you had in Australia? You've had 11 interest rate rises since May 2022. And we've witnessed the largest redistribution of income from poor to rich as a consequence. And the same sort of redistributions are going on in every country where there has been interest rate rises. Because those with financial wealth have boomed. And those that have debt have really suffered. In Australia, the monthly mortgage has gone up by 52%, about $1,600 a month on the average mortgage. It's devastating for low-income families. Well, in Japan, they didn't let any of that happen. And they're coming out of it more quickly, and the households are in better shape. Now, the question then is, well, is that unique to this culture? Well, yes. But then the second question is, well, how different is that culture to that we had in say, Australia, and I believe Britain, in the post-war period? Well, think about the big white paper statements that all the major governments made in the 1940s after, when they worked out that the prosecution of the war effort resolved the Great Depression through the spending on weapons, and the Great Depression didn't really end until the late 1930s when the governments were buying tanks and weapons. And they worked that out, and that gave Keynes and his acolytes credibility. Keynes had published in 1936. And then the challenge in the early years of the piece, in the mid-40s, was how do we maintain that fiscal activism when we're not building tanks? Well, that was the era of nation building, public transport, public education, public schooling, all of the things that I grew up and benefited from. And by the look of it, many in this room did too. And let me say, with due respect, that's one of the problems that MMT has. And it might be because it's a Friday and it's a working day, but it's not a youth thing. And the founders are getting old. But the point I'm making is that I grew up in a society which was very similar elsewhere in the Western world, which had collective will. We believed in society. We believed that the state should bring people up to scratch through its health and education spending. When I was a kid, I grew up in a very poor working class family. My father had been a prisoner of war, and we were, every year in February, we'd line up at the school and we'd go to an office and we'd be given uniforms, books, pencils, rubbers, everything that was able to make us participate in schooling, because my parents couldn't afford it. Well, that doesn't happen anymore. But that was a society that, and now that I have a deeper understanding of Japanese society, I can identify a whole lot of things in their culture that were prevalent, or as people in New South Wales say, prevalent. I'm from Victoria. The correct uses of the English language in Australia, by the way. Those things were prevalent in Australian society as well. And so it's not the point I'm making is that that's where the action's got to be, to move us back to a sense of collectiveness and to eschew the sort of things that Margaret Thatcher was talking about, that there was no society. I mean, everyone says, well, Margaret Thatcher was the turning point. Well, no, she wasn't in Britain, it was Callaghan. Margaret Thatcher just exploited the fact that they had done the initial work, the spade work. The final thing I want to talk about briefly is, and this is where my research is going these days, is the other fault line in the progressive side is green growth versus degrowth. And somehow the progressives have been shoehorned, I don't know, into this green growth paradigm. I remember last time I was here, I gave a talk in Britain, that is, I gave a talk in Edinburgh, and on the panel was the leader of the Scottish Greens. And she said, we've got to get the financial markets involved in green bond creation. And I just sort of looked at her and muttered some words to myself that I won't repeat. And increasingly, that has become the mantra of the progressive side of our societies. That, we've got to harness the financial capacity in the financial markets so that they're green and get them involved in green projects. Well, if we do that, it'll be an unmitigated disaster. And the reason they say that, of course, is because they keep believing the mainstream sound finance fictions in macroeconomics. It all comes back to that. And I'm increasingly now in the degrowth camp. And moreover, I'm now, my next book will come out maybe early next year. I'm believing that we can't survive as a civilization in a capitalist mode of production. And what I mean by that is that as long as we allocate resources and make decisions, even if we attenuate that allocation through some regulation, even if we do that, as long as we have that as our starting point, which is the basis of capitalism, then we'll always make wrong decisions in terms of the planet. Yep. And, I've read in recent days that, left-wing commentators saying that those who are in the degrowth camp are in the woke group. Why? Because it's a privileged view of those who live in advanced societies, and that they don't have any sympathy or empathy for those who live in poverty in Africa, and that a one-size-fits-all solution's not going to rub it. Well, the unfortunate fact is that it's a one planet we all live on, whether you're poor or rich. And I think the challenge, which is what I'm writing this book about, it for degrowth people, is to come up with solutions that bring material benefits to those in deep poverty while solving the challenge of decarbonisation. That's where my research is going these days. I don't think it is woke for me, as a highly paid academic who flits around, to say we should have degrowth. I think the world needs degrowth, but we also need some material growth to ease poverty. And I'm fully aware that most of us in this room are going to have severe impingement on our material standards of living. But to say that we just don't get sucked into the climate issues because we've still got to solve poverty in Africa and Latin America, etc., that's not going to rub it either, because social changes take too long for what's happening to the physical changes in the planet. And I'll leave it there, I think. Thanks very much.
I don't know if anybody saw the programme. Being very eco-orientated, we decided we'd just have one programme rather than lots of leaflets that would end up in the bin. So if you didn't see it, obviously we're going to take some questions. Thank you, Bill. Sorry, I meant to say
You're
thank
right,
you.
no worries.
We're going to take some questions now, and then we will break. I don't know what the time is now.
2:30.
2:30. So we will break around about 3 for coffee and cake, and then come back around about 3:30 for to resume the Q&A and the discussion. So thank you.
Well, I got some hands going up already. That's always good to see. I said that Bill would challenge you, and I'm sure he did. He challenged me. I wasn't expecting to learn about Japanese culture. That's been incredibly stimulating. I've not heard that before at all, and the way that Bill's brought these different nuances will be going around in our heads. So we'll take some questions now. So if you can just give me your first name, and then if Bill wants to answer, he knows who he's talking to. So my friend at the back, I've forgotten your name now. Adam, right, Adam.
I'm really interested in about your experience in Japan.
Can we get a microphone somehow? Is there a spare microphone?
It's just hard for everyone to...
Does it work on your desk, Adam?
No,
All
I
right.
don't think so.
That one.
Thank you.
Sorry, it's not about Japan. But first of all, I just wondered at the beginning of your talk, you talked about what you're seeing on the internet about activists arguing about MNT or advocating for MNT and not quite getting it right. Just because you've mentioned, the current founding fathers of MNT are getting older, what do you think we should be doing instead?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's occupied our minds. And last year Warren came. I hadn't seen Warren for a few years because of the pandemic. He came across to Kyoto. He used to always come out to Australia each year, but because I was in Japan, it was easier. And we talked about that. Each day at work, I'd go down to his hotel at lunchtime and we'd have a bit of a chat, and we talked about that extensively. What we thought would happen was that we'd get PhD programs, and that, which is a typical way in which a school of thought evolves intergenerationally. What we thought would happen was that we'd train a whole lot of PhD students and they would go out. But of course, we also understood, Warren didn't understand it because he doesn't have an academic background, but I certainly understood it, that it doesn't matter flooding the world with PhD students. They've got the challenge for us has always been to get people in high positions in the academy. Now, we've got 43 universities in Australia. There's one progressive, what I call a progressive professor in economics. And it's very interesting, and I don't want this to be taken as promoting myself. But recently, the national paper published some research which they called the Living Legends, and that they had monitored international social media and Wikipedia and stuff accessing, and they listed the top 20 Australian academics who, in terms of international exposure and global sort of awareness, there was one economist listed. Now, even though I'm known in Australia, I very rarely now get on in national media. The ABC, which is the BBC, has been basically muzzled. They're not allowed to have me on anymore. But a few years ago, I was invited to be on this program on a Monday night called Q&A, which is one of the leading programs on the ABC TV, and it's a debate. So, and it was around the fiscal statement time and the Treasurer was going to be on, the Shadow Treasurer, and they invited me to be an economist and a mainstream economist as well. Well, the Labor Party was then in opposition. They refused to go on TV with me. They said, no, we're not going to go on national TV with him. So there's all these economists that get the platform in the Australian debate. None of them have got international exposure at all. So they weren't listed among... There was only one economist as a living legend. there were lots of biologists and famous people. I just got in there by chance somehow. But the point I'm making is that the economics profession is incredibly closed, and it is here and it is there. And for MMT to make any major strides, we have to get senior professorial appointments. You know, Max Planck said a long time ago that paradigms change one funeral at a time. He didn't exactly say that, but that's what it's come down to. In other words, the older professors have to die and piss off, and then the younger academics who are constrained because of their aspirations in the hierarchy to what the older professors tolerate. Once the older ones go, then the younger ones can come through with new ideas. So it wasn't just enough to train PhDs. Warren thought that if he funded all these PhDs in America, that'd solve it. Well, where did they end up? They ended up in, second-rate colleges and non-academic positions. Not many of them are going to make it to the top. And until you're at the top of the... as a senior professor, I've got quite a lot of power within the institution. I can influence who gets hired, who gets internal research money. I can promote people to get external, help their work to get external research money. And that's how paradigms evolve. We haven't, that's why I think we haven't made much progress. We haven't made that break, and intergenerationally, there's a gap. We haven't solved it yet. Hope that answers your question. It's pessimistic.
The chap at the back.
It sounds a bit like you're trying to say we should all become politicians to make change. I'm Joe. I just wanted to ask about the employment rate in Japan. Obviously, with all of the things you mentioned they've done for the pandemic, do they have they reached full employment, and are there any kind of automatic stabilizers like something like a job guarantee that kind of, or do they also just have kind of people being employed, unemployed as the buffer stock?
In Japan?
Yeah.
Moihari, selfless compassion.
I was talking to a major employer in Japan in September this year. We had a catch-up. And I was talking to him about how I was really keen to understand things. And he said Japanese employers hate sacking workers. Hate sacking workers. It's the last thing they do. And if you look even during the property collapse and the turmoil of the 90s, unemployment hardly rose at all. It's now down to 2.1%. In the pandemic, it got high at about 4%. High, I'm joking. But for them it was high. And so and it's the same in Australia in the 50s and 60s. Our society would not tolerate unemployment. The Menzies government, which was a Conservative government, nearly lost election in the 1961 election when unemployment went from 1.9% to 2.1%. And they were in power for 17 years or something. They nearly lost the election. It's a funny story about that. They won it on Communist Party preferences in an internal Brisbane seat. And of course they were the Reds under the bed party, the Liberals. The Menzies government were, anti-communists in the extreme. But it's the same. That's what I was saying, was that these unique cultural aspects of Japanese society, you can trace similar aspects to that period in Australian society. We just made a choice to abandon them under extreme pressure from capital and the media and the rest of it. So unemployment hardly rose during the pandemic, even though they had some restrictions. Now, the other part of these cultural artefacts is that most people, everybody, during the pandemic, and I shouldn't say during the pandemic because in my view the pandemic continues, but during the early days, everybody wore masks, and they mostly still wear masks. Now, historically, Japanese people have only worn masks when they're sick. So if you get a cold in Japan, you put on a mask because you didn't want to give it to anybody else because of Omanari. Whereas everybody started wearing masks then. And so the extent to which they had restrictions, they were voluntary, they were self-enforced because of the culture. Whereas we had to tell people to stay in their homes because we're morons and don't care a stuff about the other person. The government had to stop us doing that. Japanese people did it themselves.
Well, the chap here.
Hi, I'm Craig. I just want to know why the Japanese government are still issuing bonds for the BOJ to buy up. Why are they doing that? It just seems a bit pointless when they just say it's deficit spending and be done with it.
Yeah, good question. And the answer is that don't take from what I've said that the Japanese government is MMT oriented. It's mainstream. But the culture overrides a lot of the devastating aspects of mainstream thinking. Whereas our individualistic cultures have allowed the mainstream to really be unfettered. So, you know, there's conservative economists everywhere in Japan. The Bank of Japan's got full of them. But they know the bounds in which they can operate. Whereas in Britain, the conservative economists who dominate have no bounds of civilisation. They're uncivilised, in my view. So why do they keep issuing bonds? Because they haven't yet got out of that habit that became unnecessary in August 1971 when we moved to fiat currencies. Yeah.
I think the lady next to you.
Hi, I'm Stephanie, and I was just really interested in why there seems to be so much resistance on the left to MMT ideas. So I'm involved in my local Labour Party, which is very much on the left, and you know, we've had speakers trying to talk about MMT, and there's been a lot of hostility, or people seem to understand it, but then argue very strongly for wealth tax to pay for public services. So just looking for any insight and ideas on how that MMT ideas can be made more acceptable to the left, who is drawing with the selfless compassion, hospitality, equality, but they're locked in this, you know, no money idea, so that, you know, the fiscal rule is preventing us from actually, you know, using the power of the pound. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, that's occupied my mind all my career, why people are so stupid. Sorry. And why did they start believing all this stuff? And one of the things that I've learned is that there's a deep insecurity on economic matters among progressive people. They've traditionally thought that they are the sort of kings and queens of social policy, and that what differentiates them is that, and that because they've come from the trade union movements typically. Their enemies are business, corporations, and so then they say to themselves, well, to be electorally credible, they've got to somehow convince the corporate sector. So, you know, some of you will be aware I met with John McDonnell some years ago, and, you know, he gave this spiel about how the City of London is what the Labor Party have to address, not the electorates up in the Midlands and the North, that they had to basically, and he was sending his advisors to down the city every day, not every day, but regularly. And, you know, I saw Rachel Reeves the other day saying, you know, how they've got to, in my words, appease the financial markets. Well, that comes from a deep inferiority complex. And it comes from the fact that the economics profession is basically the mainstream of the profession emerged as a voice for capital. You know, in the late 19th century, Marxism was becoming a very powerful force. Think about the 1848 revolutions, the 1871 Paris Commune. These ideas, workers were starting to work out that they were getting dudded by the ownership arrangements of this economic system. And, you know, neoclassical economics was developed, marginal productivity theory was developed, funded by the corporate sector, by the American industrialists. And marginal productivity theory emerged as a core part of neoclassical theory to make capitalism look fair, because it said that everybody got back what they put in. Whereas Marxism was saying that the workers were getting ripped off because of expropriation of surplus value. So economics is it's linked to the maintenance of corporate, the power of capital. And I think that in part explains why this inferiority complex emerges. And they've sort of got to go over the top to make themselves out to look credible. Now, why do people at branch level buy all of that and resist? Well, one of the reasons is that, another reason is because they get it every day in the media. And economics is tedious in the extreme. I wish I had become an archaeologist or something. No, seriously. Economics is, you know, it amazes me that people don't want to. At Christmas time, some friends came to our house and, you know, someone asked a question about economics and another person said, we're not talking economics here, we don't want to talk about that. Well, that's what, you know, people think economics is it's too complicated, not for them, and they get it on the TV every night, and they get mainstream, the platform is given to these mainstream economists who just use our experience as households to translate into some quasi-knowledge about governments, which is false. That's, you know, I don't know how to, I've been trying to redress that for all my career, I've failed. I've got some people in the room here. I mean, I remember Warren and I used to joke, and when Randy came involved in the project soon after, we used to say that you could fit the MMTers on one hand. Then we celebrated when we went to the second hand. And now we've got a few more, possibly. But groupthink and dissonance, cognitive dissonance and paradigm inertia is a really, you know, you think back to in medicine, where the idea that your brain can heal itself after neurogenesis, after an injury. Well, a PhD student worked that out in 1962. And because the senior professors had all built their careers on the fact that once you had a brain injury, that was it, bad luck. And all the clinical practice had evolved around that to support that hypothesis, well, they basically suppressed his work. And he left the profession. And of course, the dissonance continued through the next 30 years. But the clinical practice didn't really change. People started to observe people's brains healing themselves to some extent. And it wasn't until the cognitive dissonance became so much, it became so bloody obvious. And then another PhD that was produced, I think, around a woman in about 1996. And by then a lot of the old professors had gone, that the profession changed and now we have clinical practice based upon neurogenesis. Well, for all of those decades, we were treating people wrongly. That's the same problem. There's incredible inertia in paradigms, and the whole media structure is built around reinforcing that inertia. So a lot of people have got to die yet. Senior professors have got to die yet. And the cognitive dissonance that we're observing has to continue.
Okay, the gentleman there.
Thank you for a really thought-provoking talk, as always. I was really interested in what you were saying about the pronouns in Japan, and also you mentioned about the lack of conflict in Japan. And I was wondering if you would say a little bit more about, we were talking before we came in here in the foyer, and Stephanie was the conversation as well. If you would say a little bit more about to what extent is there democracy in the workplace in Japan, and about the differentials in pay in Japan. I mean, they're getting wider and wider in the West, aren't they? Here, including here. I mean, and how many billionaires are there in Japan? And so, I think you probably, from our discussion outside, understand where I'm coming from. But I just wonder, if the cultural differences that you've described account for, for the lack of conflict and so on. Thank you.
Well, measured inequality, wealth and income in Japan is much lower than it is in the West, the English-speaking West. That's empirical fact. And that there's been a slight increase in inequality over the last 30 years under what we call the neoliberal period, but nothing compared to what's happened in, say, Britain, Australia and the US, which there's been extraordinary shift in inequality in both wealth and income. Now, what you really wanted to ask me was that if we have a true democratisation, then people can choose their own wages. That's what you told me out in the foyer.
Yeah.
Well, as I said to you out there, that's to me a confusion, because if people can choose their own situation, that's an atomistic system. Whereas in Japan, it's a very collective system. And that everybody, so if you can choose your own outcome, those with more power and influence will get a better outcome, and I reject that. I think a pay system should be built on your contribution to the whole. And so I would have professors like me fairly low paid, whereas we're among the top paid, and I'd have cleaners and nurses and those who save us from infection, etc., being very well paid, and who died from COVID because they were on the front line, I'd have them being very well paid. And I'd have that as a collective philosophy rather than you choosing what your outcome is. In Japan, it's incredibly solidaristic society. There are pay differentials, of course.
But how does that solidaristic ethos prevail in the workplace? How do they keep the differentials lower?
Well, through collective agreements, through the bosses hating to sack workers, through I saw an article in the paper the other day. Oh, one of the problems of Japan is that there's all these men in uniforms with little light wands standing outside shopping centres and outside all buildings, and that was held out as being somehow they're unproductive and it's problematic. We would never do that in the West. Well, of course we don't do it in the West because we're idiots. They do it in Japan because those, mostly men, but there's a lot of women do it too, they go to work every day. They look after their families. They can risk manage their lives because they get an income. And whether they're absolutely necessary in the bean counter efficiency context, well, we don't think they are, but in Japan they value more, they define productivity in a much broader way than we've been trained to.
But are the workers involved in that process of
happy? Well, okay. There's research done by academics on happiness indexes, and Japanese people are much happier than they are in the English-speaking West. So yeah, we look at those guys. You go to the hardware home shop in Kyoto, and first thing you see are 2 or 3 men out the front with these wands, waving traffic and doing stuff like that. Well, they're strictly unnecessary in a narrow concept. I go into the homeware shop in Australia and they're not there, and I go into the car park and out again, so they're strictly unnecessary. But once you start thinking more broadly about productivity and societal relevance, they're very necessary because they're part of the omoiari. They're part of caring for people. They're part of keeping people involved in society. And we used to have all sorts of people like that in Australia during the 1950s and 60s. And then the mainstream came along, the neoliberals came along and said they're just leaf rakers. Well, the people who do the raking in Japan are the Buddhist monks who rake the stones in the temples in the most beautiful patterns. Well, we wouldn't have them. We'd say they're leaf rakers. They're just waste of productive resources. It's a different concept. It's a broader concept.
I think, thanks Bill, I think I'll take your question after the break, Steve.
This chap here was long.
Do you want to take one more then before the break? Go on then.
Thank you very much.
It's a
It's a privilege to be here and listening to you. So I have many questions, but let me choose only one. Olivier Blanchard, the new classical economist, once tried to refute the MMT idea of Japan based on the natural rate of interest, that the natural rate of interest in Japan is 0 or so low that they can do these things. But here it's the different case. So I would like to hear your comments on his comment, actually.
Well, the same Olivier Blanchard is the architect when he was the IMF chief economist of the Greek bailout in 2015. And if you remember what happened there, the IMF during the global financial crisis, the IMF had the notion of a growth-friendly austerity. That was the term they introduced. Now, if you know, the first rule of macroeconomics is spending equals income equals output. Cut spending, you cut output, you cut national income. It's a rule. It can't possibly be any other way. But they somehow convinced everybody, all these characters in the press, they convinced them that you could have growth-friendly austerity.
Yeah.
And at the time they told the Troika, they were part of the Troika, European Central Bank, European Commission, IMF, they published all this work saying that if the Greek government cut spending by X, then within a year unemployment would be falling and there'd be growth returning. And what was underlying their predictions was an estimate of the expenditure multiplier, which tells you how much total output rises for every injection of one unit of currency, whether it be private sector or public sector. They said that the multiplier was very close to zero, which meant if you cut the hell out of spending, you'd have hardly any impact upon output. Well, what happened? Well, the Greek economy collapsed. It's now 28% lower than it was in 2008. It's a devastated, failed colony of Germany, effectively. And about a year and a half later, Olivier Blanchard published a paper, an IMF research report, apologising, if you remember. And he said, you know, butter wouldn't melt. You know, these guys. He just said, shamelessly, oh, we got the multiplier wrong. The multiplier was actually 1.65 or something, which meant for every euro cut, GDP would fall by 1.65 euros. So billions of euros cut, 1.65 billion would be lost. And at the time, you know, I was writing saying the multiplier's around 1.6, 1.7 through the modelling that I was doing, because, you know, I was writing a lot about Europe, still am. So that's Olivier Blanchard for you, and you wouldn't believe a word he ever said. And the whole notion that they can get away with it because interest rates are so low, well, the Bank of Japan has shown that they can set the interest rate at whatever level they want and hold it there, irrespective of what the financial markets think. So this idea, that mainstream idea, is that you can't run against the financial markets. Japan's shown that you can. And you probably know about the widowmaker trade. Well, there's all these young bucks come out of physics courses or finance courses, go into investment banks, and the first thing they think they can do is take on the 10-year government bond and sell it short. And they think that they'll make heaps of money by selling it short, because they will force the Bank of Japan to push up interest rates, which will then push up yields in the bond auctions. Well, it's called the widowmaker trade because they always lose and they jump out of windows. They always lose. No one has made money selling the 10-year government bond short. Yet they think they can. Why? Because they believe in the mainstream theory that the Bank of Japan ultimately will concede. There's been intense pressure over the last 18 months for the Bank of Japan to push up interest rates. Absolutely intense. All the short trades in the market. Just constant pressure from financial markets. And the Bank of Japan just says, bugger off. Because they know that they have the currency power to override anything the financial markets want. And they can inflict constant losses on any financial market investor that tries to take them on. And that's a principle of MMT. Not that they think in those terms, but they understand their capacity. And that's why in the 90s, Japan defied the mainstream predictions.
Thanks, Bill. Well, we'll have our break. We'll come back in about half an hour and for another helping, so there are more question opportunities coming. It's not over yet. Well, I hope you've enjoyed your coffee and cake. I've got a couple of questions that have been sent in by, is it Don Wilford, and I'm going to read those, and then after that it's basically people who I remember having their hands up beforehand. Apologies if I miss you, but just put your hand up after that. So I'll ask Bill this question. Sorry, Bill, if you're ready to get going again. Sorry. it says if banks are agents of government, and Bill may have a slightly different nuance to Warren, the big three don't always agree exactly, that create money for profit, why not establish public banks to create money as grants? Loans could still be underwritten, but agreements would be for public purpose, guaranteed jobs, environmental refurbishment, etc. If there was a need to reduce the amount of for-profit money in the economy, why not create so much more money as non-repayable grants through local communities? I'll give you the bit of paper, Bill, if I ramble. Roy doesn't need it. His memory's better than mine.
Okay,
Hello. Well, the answer to the question is, first of all, commercial banks are not agents of government, and I disagree with Warren on that point. They're private corporations that have agendas that suit the interests of their shareholders, and usually they're not aligned at all with any notion of public purpose. And I've never been able to work out why Warren thinks different. But I've got a long history of advocating the abandonment of commercial banks. I don't believe there should be any private banks. I believe if you do the analysis, and sometimes I ask this question, what proportion of the total financial market transactions each day do you believe are necessary to support the real economy, so production and exchange? Does anyone want to give an estimate?
What is that? 3?
Split the difference. But whatever, I think it's approximately 2%, but who knows exactly. But the point is that 98 or something % of daily financial transactions give no support to the real economy. They're wealth shuffling, they're gambling, whatever you want to call it. The small percentage of financial market transactions that are beneficial are, for example, when you've got a manufacturer who is buying raw materials from abroad and selling locally. So they've got exchange rate risk on their cost of production. And so if some financial market speculator wants to take that risk off them through a forward contract, then that's beneficial because the manufacturer isn't really into it. Their business isn't to deal with exchange rate risk, whereas the investor takes the chance. So when a lot of people say, "Oh, speculation's evil," well, that sort of speculation is beneficial because it means that manufacturer can have more certainty in their cost management, and it will hopefully flow through to their workforce. But I'm on the record as saying we should just make all the rest of the transactions illegal. If I was in charge, they would all be illegal. I'd wipe out the financial sector because they do nothing to advance the well-being of citizens. They just cement the power of the financial elites and provide them with massive capital in which they can influence the political process to their own advantage. So the financial market banksters have replaced the robber barons of the industrial era. That's effectively what's happened. So I would have no private banks. I would have only state-run banks, democratically managed through worker cooperatives if I was in charge.
Thanks, Bill. I'd just like to say on the record, I absolutely agree with Bill's answer, but if you've ever followed me on Twitter, you know I've got a slightly left of centre perception on politics. So, yeah, any questions from the floor? The gentleman here.
Hi, my name is Graham. Is that on?
push it up.
It's on.
It is on.
It is on, yeah. Okay. So would it be fair to say that the right doesn't need to understand MMT to achieve its objectives, whereas if the left doesn't understand MMT, it won't achieve its objectives? And is that perhaps part of the reason why there's less of a market for MMT understanding?
I'm just not sure what the question is. Well, I know what the question is, but I'm not sure what the foundation of the question is. Can you just repeat it? Is it something I said?
No. I'm just trying to clarify my understanding,
Right.
which is that the right doesn't need to understand MMT to achieve its objectives.
Right.
It's achieving them under the at present.
Yeah, okay, no, I do.
Whereas the left won't.
Yeah, no, I get it. If you go back to the 1970s and you think of the narratives that emerged then that have persisted since. One of the narratives from the right was that globalisation and of supply chains and internationalisation of foreign capital, cross-border capital flows, had rendered the nation state impotent. That was the narrative. That the state no longer was able to prioritise domestic policy unless it was compatible with the interests of the capital flow markets. That was what the right started to pump out, and this was a period following the Power Manifesto in America in 1971, where the think tanks all emerged. All these think tanks that are out there pumping out bullshit every day, they emerged in that period to provide a so-called cloak of legitimacy, research authority, to just pure right-wing propaganda. Now, the left bought all that. If you read the literature on the left, the progressive people in the 1970s, they all agreed that financial capital had become so powerful that the governments had to appease those markets, otherwise they would lose their currencies. Now, what actually happened was that the right knew all along that if it wanted to achieve its agendas, privatisation, outsourcing, user pays, all the rest of it, then there was only one way it could do it: through the state. The legislative power of the state was used for all of those things. So far from going away and becoming impotent, the state was just reconfigured. So in the 1960s and early 70s, the state was a mediator between capital and labour in various ways. Well, by the way that what happened was the reconfiguration converted the state into an agent of capital. But if you look at all the major things we call neoliberalism, all the major changes that have occurred, the industrial relations legislations attacking unions, all of the welfare support, income support changes, all of the industry policy, the procurement policies, the attacks on local government, they've all come through legislative and regulative capacity of the state. And so the right knew that all along. The left has been duped into believing the state's impotent. Oh, we can't do anything, The British Labour Party, we've got to suck up to the city because they think that the city can undermine the currency. Well, no, it can't. And so that's been the problem, that And it relates to the question I think Stephanie asked before. The left has just gone blind. And the right is much better funded, much more smart, and to some extent much more focused. Because I think that the left has a lot of people with good principles about humanity. And then we get lost in interesting debates, philosophical debates about those principles. Whereas the right are very focused, maintaining hegemony of capital, redistributing as much income to the top end of town as possible. They're very focused agendas. And I think that they are less likely to get diverted into debates about minutiae and principles that the left get caught up in.
Thank you. Just to mention, if you haven't read Bill's book with Thomas Farsi, Reclaiming the States, I mean, many of you will have read that book. It's fantastic. So I absolutely recommend it if you've not got it already. I'll take you, Adam, after this chat.
Free advertising.
The guy here, this chap here, I don't know his name, sorry.
Tim here. Yeah, Tim. So just going to your argument about how you get MMT, maybe one of the problems I see is that economic discussion is being sort of raised to that of the high priests. They sort of use terms that aren't really applicable to most people, and that's how they make it a boring subject. Oh, we don't know about it. My point is that maybe should we be focusing rather on money? I'm not saying money isn't important; it is an important element, but the basis of economics is resources, and we should really be talking about resources. And I'd sort of give you the example that in the 1950s, a family could be supported by one income. They would have a secure home, holidays, whatever, let's say 50s, 60s. And now we're so much richer, resource-wise, that we're struggling to pay our bills. So if we frame the economic argument rather than in monetary terms, which can sound illogical, counterproductive, or whatever, it becomes so much easier to see economics in a resource system than a monetary system.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, one of the things I always say, I didn't say it today, so I don't always say it, is that what MMT does is shift your focus away from financial thinking to real resource thinking. If you really start getting it, you start asking questions about real resources, not about money. And whether we've done a good enough job on that, I'm not sure. But, you know, I'm always trying to work out ways in which to bring the ideas which are fairly abstract in part. I mean, macroeconomics as a discipline is an abstraction. There's no such thing as a general price level. You know, what is it? Well, it's very complex. And so I'm always trying to work out ways to make it easier. So my latest creation is this manga. I don't know if you've seen it. I've got a manga, The Adventures, the Smith family and their adventures. And well, you should have a look at it and give me some feedback. And it's highly popular in Japan now. They like manga, but I don't know how much popularity is in the English. We've got an English version and a Japanese version, and the unfortunate thing is that a lot of the American MMTs are not promoting it at all, and that's a separate issue. But so that's an example. There's lots of ways where I've been trying to change the way in which the narrative is presented. So I'm now writing cartoons for kids. And whether that works, who knows? I'll die before I'm successful, I think.
Thanks, Bill. Any more questions of the chap here?
My name's Rod. I
I'm not an economist, I'm a physicist, but
You're probably lucky in that respect.
MMT appealed to me when I first learned about it, maybe 10 years ago. What I'm worried about at my age is the effect of climate change on my family, my grandchildren. We have a very short time to get things moving, and neither major party is talking like this at all. The party that should be pushing this is so frightened about not winning the election that it's prepared, or it's allowed, the Conservative Party to dictate the terms on which it might be elected. So they have actually just thrown in the towel, and they're promising exactly the same things that the Tories are promising. I think, I'm asking you, do you think it's now time for a realignment of the left? Because as you said, there are good people in the Labour Party, there are good people in all parties, just about. But it's not going to happen with the present leadership of the Labour Party. Everybody of a slightly left-wing bent has been purged. And my local constituency party, the councillors have all left the Labour Party. They're now independent because the interference from Starmer and his buddies it's a typical sort of Stalinist purge. And I don't think we can persuade MMT or Action on Climate Change until we have a strong left-wing party. So how are your feelings about this?
Yeah, it's the same back home. And look, the institutions, the political institutions that evolved, depending where you start, which countries, but evolved sort of in the 1930s, 1940s, that created social democratic movements to provide political voice to the trade union movement. Effectively, that's what the Labour parties and the socialist parties and the Democrat parties in the Democrat Party in the US were about, more or less. Those institutions have run their course. And we saw it really happening in Australia in the sort of 1970s, where the people coming into the Labour Party, the polity that is, were no longer coming through the trade union movement as tradespeople or manual workers. They were coming from the emerging middle class families through university education. Then they might get a job in a union for 3 months, and then they would get pre-selection and become a Labour Party MP, and they were lawyers and accountants and all sorts of professions. And they'd become careerists rather than motivated by public service. And we saw that, I think that same trends have happened here in the Labour Party, certainly in Europe, right through Europe. And so the institutions that really were the voices, and the Australian Labour Party had a meeting in the 1970s and 1980s it was, at the annual conference, and abandoned the term socialism from their mission statement. Just said no, that's not what we're in. So the raison d'etre for those institutional structures has continued. The institutional structures have continued, but the raison d'etre was lost years ago. And so there's two debates. There's two debate teams. One in the left. One is that we can reform all that from within. Let's keep voting Labor because we'll put pressure on our leaders, and well, good luck with that, because it's been getting worse, not better. And the other group, which I would belong in, says that I want the Labor Party in Australia to be wiped out. I want them to be so devastated. They're in the government now, by the way. They refuse to call for a ceasefire in Gaza. Dirty bastards. So my view on the situation is that I want them to be so electorally devastated and lose so many seats that the progressive elements form a new party. I think it's the only way forward. And I think it's the same in Britain. The institutional structure of the British Labor Party is rotten to the core. Same as the Australian Labor Party. Same as the Labor Party in New Zealand. Same as the Social Democrats in Canada. Same as the Democrats in Britain, in the US. And we could go through Europe. They're rotten to the core, and they've ceased to serve their purpose, representing the voice of the workers. And I don't know when that will ever happen. I'm giving a talk to the Workers' Party tomorrow here, and apparently they're getting all these people from the left of the Labor Party that Starmer has purged, and they now sense they've got some sort of electoral possibilities. I don't know whether that's possible, true or false, I doubt it. But they can dream. But George Galloway thinks he's in on a winner now, but we'll see. So I think I agree with you that I don't believe the trade union movement should any longer give funding to the Labor parties. I think they should defund them, and that would wipe out the Australian Labor Party, by the way. If the trade union movement stopped funding them, that'd be the end of them. And I don't think anyone with progressive tendencies or inclinations should give any voting support to the Australian Labor Party. They just should. We should get rid of them. And something new. There was a reason why the trade union movement formed, why welfare states formed in the late 19th century, and why Labor parties formed to represent politically those voices. There was a reason that capitalism, industrial capitalism, had pushed the working class so far that it was no longer tolerable. And so in so-called democracies, the workers got a voice. That's why it happened. Now, a lot of those changes have been retrenched since. Aided and abetted by Labor Party politicians, by the way, the major neoliberal reforms in Australia came in the 1980s under the Hawke-Keating Labor government. The Howard government that followed was just building on the damage already done by the Labor Party. So that's my view.
Thanks, Bill. The lady there.
Yeah. I just wanted to build on that because I completely agree with you that there needs to be a new party. I'm a little bit biased. I'm part of the Green Party, and probably a lot of you will look at the current policy and be like, oh my God, what are they doing? The sovereign money. Completely agree. That's why I joined the Green Party, because I completely agree with their progressive policies. Like, they want to do everything that we're talking about here, right? But they are still talking about funding it with taxes, which we all know to be completely wrong. But the way it works in the Green Party is that members dictate policy. So I am now part of the Finance and Economy Working Group in the Green Party, and I have been working to get MMT on their agenda. They're making a modification to it right now so that banks can request loans from the central government to enable them to keep lending out more money. We obviously want to make it completely different, but I just want to push it out there as they're bigger than the Socialist Workers' Party. They really listen to members. They are a good party. They're calling for a ceasefire in Palestine right from the start. And I think getting people from here, they're getting their feedback in that party would just be absolutely invaluable. So my name's Sheridan. Come talk to me if you want to talk about Green Party stuff.
Thanks very much. I mean, I'm on the record as calling the Australian Greens neoliberals on bikes. And I remember I used to get invited to their national conference, and I was good friends with Bob Brown, who was the leader for very many years, and a beautiful person, very dedicated and very sound. And he said to me one day after I gave a talk, he said, Bill, he said, you're right, but he said that as a minority party, we can't afford to take on those issues, because we have to neutralise those issues so that we can get any traction on our other issues. And I said to him, I said, Bob, so what you want to do is lie to the Australian people? And he said, well, sort of, yeah. And I said to him, but the thing that you haven't quite, the next step that you haven't quite put together is that you won't be able to get those other things that you really care about, like the climate issues, without solving the economic issues. And that was the bit that they couldn't, and so they can't bring themselves to breaking out because they think they've got to neutralise that part of the debate, because this part that they really want to focus on is too radical anyway, so they've got to look as moderate and safe as possible. And that's been the problem of Green parties everywhere. I'm not saying it is in Britain, but it has been everywhere.
I've stood for the Green Party twice in general elections. My main stumbling block with, we went to the Green Party conference in, where was it, Newport, wasn't it, a few years ago. And the people from the main body of the Green Party, they just would not talk to us. We've had years ago, we had a meeting where Stephen Hale was with Molly Cato. She was writing notes and that, but she completely blanked me at conference. So I'm not holding out too much hope if you can do better than the other people who've tried to, all power to you. But I think it is still a hard ask, so I'll just wish you all the luck as well.
The other problem too, and I don't know whether this is a problem in Britain, but in Australia the Greens Party are a combination of the old industrial communist left, who have left the Labor Party, and the tree hugger conservative who haven't really got a coherent idea about industry other than to stop it. And those two factions really are incompatible under the current situation.
I think what's really great about the current iteration of the Green Party is they understand there is no climate justice without social justice. And so that is really what forms the foundation of all of these policies. So I feel hopeful.
I gave a talk a long time ago where the foundation of the concept of just transition came from a Canadian trade union leader who worked in pharmaceutical industry, like a heavy polluting industry. And he said that the only way in which climate agendas are going to become more mainstream is if you also solve the jobs problem. So the Greens Party in Australia goes into small country towns and says, let's just shut down all the timber industry. Well, there's people in those towns, or lately the mining industry. Newcastle, where I sort of live some of the time, is the world's largest coal export port. It's huge. And the Greens go in there and say to the up the valley, to the mines, yeah, we've got to shut them down. But they provide absolutely zero alternative. Those people have got mortgages, they've got kids, they've got, commitments. And so unless you solve that, and that trade unionists in the mid-90s in Canada knew that. So the Greens have to be more focused on jobs, because that's central to our lives.
Do you have a question, Adam? Yeah.
Sorry to put away from the climate change debate. Just to go back to the original question, you said you would ban private banking. Do you mean private credit creation, or are you suggesting banning credit unions, savings and loans, all private financial institutions? And then secondly, I think it's you that talked about on your blog about the positive reception you keep receiving when you discuss MMT amongst financiers and in the city. Why is that not filtering out? If it's so beneficial for them because they want the extra investment because they can make more money, what is it you think stopping that becoming more mainstream?
Yeah, I don't know to that. What I would say is that, and it's a delicate thing, how I say it, is that I no longer think it's valuable talking to community groups. I used to do it, I still do it. Louisa, my wife, says I don't know the word no. I still do it, but I don't think there's much traction in that anymore. Going into a hall of 100 people who are all tree huggers, beautiful people, don't get me wrong. And the human interaction is very important. But in political terms, it's a waste of time. So I do a lot of work now in small workshop groups with investment banks and financial market people. I do a lot of Zoom sessions with those type of characters because they are the ones that get the voice in the ear of the political process. And, you know, I've been heavily criticised on the left for working in Japan with, you know, the Conservative government there, the Liberal Democrat government, a right-wing government. And my response is, and I also get criticised for talking to the financial markets, but my response is this, that I don't care who's in government because I'll talk to them if I can influence them because they're the ones that make the policy. Spending all your time talking to people who already have the same view as you, it's not going to make much difference to the world, is it? So anyway, up until now, those people that I turn into MMTs through education, the financial guys, they don't seem to be, I think they're making money from it rather than influencing politicians. It's different in Japan. I have a voice in Japan and I can get on TV and get access to 30 million people like that. As to banks, look, I don't want any private banks. I don't. Why do we need private banks? Why do we need bank shareholders ripping people off through all the things that the private banks do? Why do we need them? When I grew up, we had state banks. There were only a few private banks. We had the State Bank of Victoria, the SSB. And as kids, we learnt to put money in little till boxes with a little B. State Bank of Victoria. That was a conduit for working capital for industry, for home mortgages. It was able to recycle savings very adequately. Why do we need to make... The point I'd make in general is that I would have as I want to minimise the number of things that make private profit, number of activities. I want to socialise as many activities as possible. I want to get capital out of as many things as possible. That's my philosophy. Pie in the sky, I know, but it's my philosophy.